It was a quiet, uneventful evening as Marcus Thompson cruised down the empty streets, the headlights of his car casting long shadows on the pavement. He had just finished a long shift at the hospital, his mind still buzzing with the demands of the day. As a respected doctor and, more recently, the newly appointed police chief, he was used to juggling the weight of his responsibilities. But tonight, something felt different. The air seemed heavy, thick with the kind of tension you couldn't quite put your finger on. Just as Marcus was about to turn onto his street, the flashing lights of a squad car appeared behind him, red and blue. The sirens screamed to life, cutting through the silence. It wasn't unusual for police to pull someone over late at night, but tonight it felt off. Marcus did what anyone would do, slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. He knew how important it was to comply in these situations, even as a police chief. He rolled down his window, bracing himself for the usual routine. A tall, white officer with a stern look on his face approached the driver's side window. His partner, another officer, hovering behind him. Both were wearing the standard police uniform, but something in their demeanor told Marcus this wasn't going to be a typical stop. The officer glanced at Marcus briefly before starting to speak. "License and registration," the officer barked. His tone was sharp, and there was something about his gaze that made Marcus's chest tighten. He handed over his documents, keeping his voice calm. "I'm Marcus Thompson. I work at the hospital down the street." The officer didn't acknowledge his words. Instead, he glanced at Marcus's license and gave a quick nod to his partner. "What's the hurry tonight, Mr. Thompson? You were speeding." Marcus frowned. Speeding? He hadn't been speeding. The whole situation was odd, and the more the officer spoke, the more Marcus's instincts told him this wasn't just a random stop. Before Marcus could respond, the officer's partner leaned in, eyeing Marcus with a scrutinizing look that made him feel exposed, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. "Step out of the vehicle," the first officer ordered, voice cold and forceful. Marcus froze for a second. Something about this felt wrong. Far more than just a routine traffic stop. He knew what it felt like to be a black man interacting with law enforcement. But this wasn't normal. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. Should he comply? Was there something deeper at play here? "Is there a problem, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. "We'll deal with that in a second. Step out of the car now." There was no mistaking it now. These officers weren't just doing their job. They were looking for trouble. What would happen next? What were these officers really after? Marcus had to think fast. He knew the stakes were high, but before he could even process his next move, the officer reached for his radio, calling in backup. The air around Marcus seemed to thicken as he sat in the car, wondering if he could talk his way out of this or if tonight would spiral into something much bigger. This wasn't just a simple traffic stop. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was about to change everything. What would you do in Marcus's shoes? How would you handle this tense situation? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The story gets even more intense from here. You won't want to miss what happens next. Growing up in the heart of Chicago, Marcus Thompson knew what it felt like to be judged by the color of his skin. His mother, a single parent, worked tirelessly to provide for him and his younger sister, Cassandra. Though they didn't have much, she made sure they always had enough love and support to face the world. "You can be anything you want to be, Marcus," his mother often told him, her words ringing in his ears as he walked through the streets of their rough neighborhood. But, even as a child, Marcus knew the world didn't see him the same way it saw other kids. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers that followed him wherever he went, the assumptions people made about him based solely on his skin. By the time he was in high school, Marcus was determined to prove the world wrong. He threw himself into his studies, determined to be the best version of himself no matter what it took. His mother had instilled in him a sense of pride, and he clung to that, even as he faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. At the age of 18, Marcus left his home in Chicago to attend college on a full scholarship. It wasn't easy. He had to navigate a world where he was often one of the few black students in predominantly white classrooms. But Marcus was no stranger to overcoming obstacles. His intelligence, work ethic, and resilience won him respect from professors and peers. You belong here, one of his professors had told him after Marcus scored higher than any other student in his class on a major exam. The words stuck with him, pushing him forward even when self-doubt crept in. But while Marcus excelled academically, his life wasn't without its struggles. After graduation, he decided to pursue a career in medicine. He worked grueling hours as a resident at a busy hospital, and while his medical career was taking off, he also knew that he couldn't ignore the injustices that plagued his city. His passion for justice and community outreach led him to volunteer, with local organizations hoping to make a difference. And then, one fateful day, he received a call that would change everything. The city had just experienced a wave of protests and public outcry over police brutality. The mayor, desperate for change, reached out to Marcus with an offer he never expected: to become the city's first black police chief. At first, Marcus was hesitant. The job seemed like a daunting challenge. How could he, a man who had spent his life fighting against the very system he was about to join, navigate the politics and corruption of a police force that had historically oppressed people like him? But the mayor promised that Marcus would have the freedom to reform the department from the inside, to be a beacon of hope in a system that needed change more than ever. After much consideration, Marcus accepted the offer, knowing that this was his chance to make real change. He would be a force for good in a department that had been broken for years. He wasn't just going to be the police chief, he was going to be a bridge, a leader who could mend the rift between law enforcement and the community. Marcus knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance. There would be moments when he'd have to face his own fears and biases. But he also knew that his story, the story of a black man who defied the odds and rose to the top, was one of resilience, and that strength would guide him through even the darkest moments. As he stood at the front of the department for the first time, swearing in as the new chief, Marcus felt a deep sense of purpose. He was no longer just a doctor or a community volunteer. He was a leader, one who would fight to make sure that the future of his city would be different from its past. But as he stood there in his uniform, ready to lead, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the real challenges were just beginning. Would the officers under his command be willing to follow him, or would they resist the changes he had promised to make? And how would the community react when they learned that their new police chief was a black man, determined to reform a system that had long been entrenched in racism? The answers to these questions were uncertain, but Marcus was prepared to face whatever lay ahead. "This is just the beginning," he whispered to himself, and yet, as fate would have it, the very thing he feared most would confront him sooner than he expected. Tonight, during a routine traffic stop, Marcus would come face to face with the kind of racism he had spent his entire life fighting against. What would he do when the world he had built as a police chief collided with the harsh realities of the streets he once walked as a young man? The stage was set. As the moments dragged on, the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. Marcus's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he glanced at the rear-view mirror, catching a glimpse of the two officers standing just behind his car. Their faces were cold, unreadable, their stance rigid, almost predatory. This wasn't just a simple traffic stop. Something about their attitude felt wrong, as if they were waiting for him to make a move, a mistake, anything that would give them an excuse to escalate the situation. Marcus knew the script. Stay calm, stay in control, and don't give them a reason to treat him like the criminal they clearly expected him to be. The officer at the window, still holding his hand on the door, snapped out an order. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus's heart began to race, but his voice remained steady as he responded. "Is there a reason for that, officer? What seems to be the problem?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exchanged a quick look with his partner, who was standing just behind him, arms crossed. They didn't seem to be in any rush to explain themselves. The second officer stepped forward, his eyes scanning Marcus with an air of suspicion that made Marcus uncomfortable. "You fit the description of someone we've been looking for," the second officer finally said. "We got a tip-off that a guy matching your description was involved in some suspicious activity around here." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity?" He looked the officer up and down. I'm coming from the hospital, officer. I'm a doctor. I don't know what you're talking about. The first officer ignored Marcus's attempt to clarify and repeated the order. Step out of the vehicle. Now. A cold chill ran down Marcus's spine. This wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. The officers were treating him like a suspect. His gut told him this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It felt deliberate. Something more sinister was at play. For a split second, Marcus considered his options. He could comply with the officer's demands, but that would mean submitting to a process that felt wrong from the start. Or he could push back, but that might give them an excuse to escalate things further. He took a deep breath and made a decision. The last thing he needed was to make a scene, especially given who he was, the newly appointed police chief of the city. He couldn't risk giving these officers more reason to treat him like an outsider, no matter how unfair the situation was. His training kicked in, and he decided to de-escalate. Look, officer, Marcus began, keeping his voice calm but firm. I've already told you who I am. I'm not the person you're looking for. I'm not a criminal. The first officer stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. We don't know who you are, and frankly, we don't care. You're getting out of the car. At that moment, Marcus's patience began to wear thin. The officer's words were dripping with a level of hostility that was all too familiar. It was a feeling he had grown up with, a feeling of being unjustly targeted simply because of who he was. His heart started to pound in his chest, but he fought to keep his composure. No, he wasn't going to let this go down like this. Not tonight. In one smooth motion, Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out his badge, his police chief's badge. It gleamed in the streetlight as he held it out toward the officer. I'm the police chief of this city, Marcus said, his voice low but laced with authority. I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. The officers froze. For a split second, neither of them moved, both of them staring at the badge in disbelief. Marcus could see the color drain from their faces as they processed what they were looking at. The first officer's hand faltered as he reached for his radio, clearly flustered. You're the chief? His voice was no longer confident, now laced with a hint of fear. The second officer, still standing behind him, visibly shifted his weight, as if unsure whether to back away or continue the confrontation. Marcus's pulse slowed a bit, but his frustration was still bubbling beneath the surface. These officers didn't know who he was, didn't care to know, and had already decided to treat him with suspicion. All of it, the hostility, the aggressive behavior, it was all based on one simple fact: his race. He had expected challenges in his new role. As the police chief, he had anticipated the subtle resistance, the ingrained biases in a department that was overwhelmingly white. But this wasn't just ignorance, it was overt racism. The first officer stammered, still holding onto his radio, his face turning a shade paler. I didn't know, sir. I didn't recognize you. I'm sorry, Marcus cut him off, his voice icy now. I don't want an apology. I want to know why you thought it was okay to treat me like this. The second officer finally spoke up, his voice lower now, though still tinged with a kind of shame. It was a mistake, Chief. We didn't mean any disrespect. Marcus took a step closer, feeling the weight of his badge in his hand, the responsibility he carried as the leader of the department now heavy on his chest. You didn't mean disrespect, huh? He said slowly, his gaze hard. Do you treat everyone this way, or just people who look like me? The officers exchanged a glance, but neither had an answer. It was in that moment, standing there in the darkness, with the sirens still flashing in the distance, that Marcus realized this was about more than just one bad traffic stop. This was a symptom of a deeper, more insidious problem. Racism. It was alive and well, even in the force he now led. Marcus took a step back, his mind already racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. He knew that. His position as police chief would be tested in ways he hadn't yet imagined. These officers, these people in positions of power, had just shown him exactly what kind of battle he was facing, and Marcus Thompson wasn't backing down. But what would happen next? How would he handle this new level of betrayal within his own department? Keep reading to find out. The air was thick with tension as Marcus stood there staring down the officers who had once held power over him. power he had never imagined using against him in such a personal way. The flashing lights from their squad car illuminated the street, casting long shadows across the asphalt. He could feel his heart still pounding, the anger and frustration building up, but he knew he had to think strategically. This was his moment to decide how he would move forward, how he would fight for what he believed in. This was bigger than just a single confrontation. The two officers still stood there, awkwardly shifting their weight, clearly unsure of what to do next. Marcus didn't look at them. His focus was on the bigger picture. The department, the community, the systemic issues. It was all converging right here on this street. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up behind them. The unmistakable rumble of another squad car filled the air, and Marcus's instincts told him this wasn't just a routine backup. The officers had called for reinforcements, likely thinking that his attempt at asserting authority would escalate into something worse. The squad car rolled to a stop just a few feet away, and Marcus turned to see who had arrived. The door opened, and a familiar face stepped out. It was Detective Rachel Hayes, one of the few officers in the department whom Marcus genuinely trusted. She had been with the force for years and had a reputation for being fair-minded and fiercely committed to serving the community. But even she could see the storm brewing. "Chief," Rachel said, her voice calm but laced with concern. "What's going on here?" The two officers stiffened at her presence, but Rachel's steady gaze made them think twice about reacting with hostility. Marcus didn't waste time explaining. He simply raised his badge again, holding it out toward her. "These two officers pulled me over, accused me of something I didn't do, and then tried to force me out of my car without cause. I don't know if they're racist or just bad at their jobs, but either way, they need to understand the consequences of their actions." Rachel's eyes flicked between Marcus and the two officers, and she took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Is that true?" she asked, her tone no nonsense but professional. The first officer, the one who had initially ordered Marcus out of the car, seemed to shrink under her gaze. "We didn't recognize him, Detective," he muttered. "It was a mistake. We just didn't mean any harm," the second officer quickly added, trying to salvage the situation. But Rachel wasn't buying it. She had seen this type of excuse before. "A mistake," she repeated, her voice low. "You pulled over the chief of police and you didn't recognize him. You don't know the department's leadership or you just don't care." The officers exchanged a nervous look but didn't respond. Marcus felt a mixture of anger and disbelief, but he knew Rachel wasn't the problem here. She was on his side. The real issue was how deep the rot went in the department. It wasn't just these officers. It was systemic. It was embedded in the culture. These two had made their mistake, but what if it was just the tip of the iceberg? "You're lucky I'm here, or this would have gone a lot differently," Rachel said, addressing the officers with a calm but unmistakable authority. She turned to Marcus. "I'll make sure this gets reported, but I'm going to need you to come with me, Chief. We need to handle this the right way, publicly. We can't let this slide." Marcus nodded slowly, but inside, he knew this was only the beginning. The department needed a reckoning, and he was the one who was going to bring it. The events of this night weren't just a random error. They were proof of the work that still needed to be done to root out the biases that ran through the very veins of the police force he was now in charge of. Rachel's presence was a reminder that not all the officers were like this. He had allies, but the problem was bigger than any one officer or one department. It was a cultural war that would take time to change, and Marcus had no illusions about how difficult it would be to overcome the systemic racism within the ranks. As he turned toward the squad car, preparing to leave with Rachel and begin the long process of dealing with the fallout from this incident, his mind raced. How could he make real change when those in power, the people he needed to trust, were so deeply entrenched in their prejudices? The answer was clear. He had to be the example. No matter how much pushback he got, no matter how many times the department tried to undermine him, he had to lead by showing that change was possible, even in the most unlikely of places. This fight was going to be messy, but it was a fight worth having. As they drove away from the scene, Marcus couldn't shake the weight of the situation. He was on the right side of history, but it was going to take every ounce of strength he had to move this department forward, and just as Rachel had said, this was only the beginning. There would be protests, media scrutiny, and internal resistance from officers who would rather see him fail than succeed. But none of that mattered. Marcus Thompson was determined to see this fight through no matter what it cost him. His battle was just beginning. How would Marcus hold on to his leadership while confronting the entrenched racism within his own department? And what would it take to change the hearts and minds of the officers who still didn't believe in his vision of justice? The next few days were a blur for Marcus. The confrontation with the two officers had sparked a firestorm within the department, and he found himself fielding phone calls from all sides, interested parties, media outlets, and, of course, his superiors at City Hall. The mayor's office had already issued a public statement, distancing itself from the officers' actions, but Marcus knew that words weren't going to be enough. In private, Rachel had been his rock, keeping him grounded and helping him navigate the storm. But even she couldn't hide her concern. The department was divided, and if things didn't change, the rift between the officers who had sworn to protect and serve the people and the community they served could tear apart everything Marcus was trying to build. Marcus sat alone in his office late one evening, his eyes fixed on the stack of reports on his desk. The city had been buzzing with news of the traffic stop, and the public was demanding answers. He knew the public's trust was fragile, especially after years of broken promises and failed reforms. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," Marcus called out, rubbing his temples. The door opened and Rachel stepped inside. She didn't say anything at first, just gave him a nod as she closed the door behind her. Marcus could tell from the look on her face that something was wrong. "Marcus," she started, her tone serious. "We need to talk." He gestured for her to sit, but he could already tell that the news wasn't going to be good. Rachel wasn't one to sugarcoat things. "About the officers," she continued, taking a seat in front of his desk. "I've been going through their records. I think you need to see something." Marcus leaned forward, his heart skipping a beat. "What's going on?" Rachel hesitated before she slid a file across the desk. This came from an anonymous source. "It's about Officer Daniels, the one who first pulled you over." Marcus took the file from her, his fingers trembling slightly. Inside there were copies of internal documents, performance evaluations, and most disturbingly an email thread. As he scanned the contents, his gut tightened. The email exchange was between Officer Daniels and a few other officers, and the language was unmistakable. Racist, derogatory comments about people of color, including some about their own colleagues on the force. This can't be real," Marcus muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is from an officer on my team?" Rachel nodded, her expression grim. "It gets worse. Daniels isn't the only one. I've found similar exchanges from others. In the department, officers with long-standing records of discrimination. It's a pattern, Marcus, and I think it goes much deeper than we realized." Marcus's stomach churned. He had suspected as much, but seeing it in black and white, knowing that these were people he was responsible for, it hit him harder than he anticipated. This wasn't just about a single bad interaction. This was about a culture of hate and intolerance that had festered within his own department for years, maybe decades. He clenched his jaw, trying to fight back the anger rising in his chest. "I should have known. I should have seen this coming." Rachel put a hand on his arm, her voice soft but firm. "You can't blame yourself for this, Marcus. You didn't create this culture, but you're the one who can change it. You have to. For the community, for the people you serve, and for yourself. This is your chance to make it right." Marcus took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. He had always known that his path would be difficult, but he hadn't imagined it would be this hard. These weren't just rogue officers acting outside the law. They were a reflection of a system, a culture that needed to be dismantled from the inside. Rachel's words cut through the fog in his mind. This was his chance, but how could he, a black man in a position of power, challenge the very institution that was supposed to protect everyone, including people like him? His mind was spinning, the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He looked up at Rachel, meeting her eyes with determination. "What do we do now?" Rachel's expression softened. "We go public, Marcus. You have to address this head-on. The city deserves to know the truth. They need to see that you're not just a figurehead. You're serious about reform." Marcus nodded slowly, his resolve hardening. He knew what he had to do. He had to face the reality that the battle wouldn't be won overnight. The forces aligned against him were vast, but that only made his mission clearer. The following afternoon, Marcus called an emergency press conference. Reporters gathered in front of City Hall, their cameras flashing as he stepped up to the podium. His heart beat loudly in his chest, but he was ready. This was the moment he had to step into the light, unflinching, unapologetic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice steady and firm, "I stand before you today not just as the police chief of this city, but as a man who believes in the power of change, in the power of accountability. What happened during the traffic stop earlier this week is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a much larger problem, one that I am committed to addressing head-on." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. The reporters were all listening intently, their pens poised, their cameras focused. "I have been made aware of a deeply troubling pattern of discriminatory behavior within the department, behavior that has no place in any law enforcement agency, especially one that is meant to serve and protect every citizen. The officers involved in this pattern of racism will be held accountable, and I will ensure that we do everything in our power to rebuild the trust that has been lost. This will not be an easy journey. It will be uncomfortable, but it is necessary. It is time for this department to face the truth." The room was silent for a moment before the questions began. The media wanted answers, real answers. They wanted specifics, timelines, and promises, but Marcus didn't shy away. He answered every question, his resolve strengthening with every word he spoke. It wasn't going to be easy, but as he left the podium, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. The truth had been spoken, and now the real work began. How would Marcus deal with the backlash from his own officers? Could he transform the department into the model of justice and fairness he envisioned? Stay tuned for Chapter 6 as Marcus faces the hardest challenge of his career. The aftermath of Marcus's public announcement had been swift, and the reactions were mixed. He had expected resistance, but the flood of anger and disbelief that came from within the department was far greater than he had anticipated. Some officers rallied behind him, ready for reform, eager to help root out the problems. But many others, the ones who had quietly tolerated or even supported the corrupt culture, were furious. They saw his actions as a betrayal, and they were not shy about making their displeasure known. In the days that followed, Marcus faced more than just the immediate fallout of his statements. He received anonymous threats, warning him to back down, to stop digging into the department's history. His office had been vandalized, nothing major, but enough to send a message. He'd expected it, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. Still, he kept his head high, as did Rachel, who remained steadfast by his side. Together they pushed forward, but every step was harder than the last. The hardest conversation came the next week, when Marcus sat down with Captain Harrison, an old friend and mentor, who had once served as his guiding force in the department. Harrison had always been a staunch believer in law and order, but in the wake of Marcus's public revelations, his loyalty to the old guard was beginning to show cracks. "Marcus," Harrison began, his voice measured, "I've known you a long time. You're a good man and I admire your dedication. But what you're doing, you're making a mistake. You're pulling apart the only thing we've got." Marcus looked Harrison squarely in the eyes. The weight of his mentor's words stung, but he wasn't backing down. "Captain, this department is broken, and as much as it pains me to say, it's been broken for years. We can't pretend like it doesn't have problems that are deep and systemic. The truth has to come out, even if it's uncomfortable." Harrison's face was clouded with a mixture of sadness and frustration. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly wrestling with the shifting landscape. "The department has always had its issues, but this is going to tear us apart. You think the public will back you when you start going after our own like this? They don't see what we deal with every day, Marcus. They don't understand the pressure we're under." Marcus clenched his fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I understand the pressure, Captain. I know what you mean. But the fact that we've tolerated this toxic culture for so long, it's not just hurting us, it's hurting the people we're supposed to protect. If we don't change, we become part of the problem. We become the enemy. The room was silent for a long moment. Harrison looked down, avoiding Marcus's gaze, clearly torn. He wanted to believe that Marcus was wrong, that they could fix things quietly, from within. But deep down, Harrison knew that Marcus was right. The rot ran too deep for them to ignore it any longer. Finally, Harrison spoke, his voice soft and resigned. "I'm not sure how to fix this, Marcus, but I'll help you however I can. I don't want to see you burn out over this." "Thank you, Captain," Marcus said, a weight lifting slightly from his shoulders. He had expected more resistance, but to have Harrison's support, however tentative, was a small victory. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus's resolve continued to be tested. The internal investigations into the officers involved in the racist behavior had begun, but it was slow-going. Evidence was being collected, interviews were being conducted, and department leaders were forced to confront the truth, even if they didn't want to. One evening, as Marcus was leaving his office late, he found a note on his desk. It was simple, but the words were powerful. "Your courage is the change we need. Don't give up. We're with you." No signature. But Marcus knew who it was from. It was a sign that, despite the hostility, there were still good people within the department. People who were willing to stand by him as he fought for justice. Still, every day was a battle. Marcus had no illusions about the fight ahead. As weeks passed, more details came to light about the officers involved in the racist emails and discriminatory behavior. The officers were put on administrative leave, and some faced potential termination or legal consequences. The media coverage intensified, but it wasn't just the negative press that made Marcus's stomach churn. It was the realization that the change he was trying to instigate was shaking the very foundations of his department. But despite the pressure, despite the isolation that he sometimes felt, Marcus knew there was no turning back. This was the right thing to do. His commitment to creating a more just and equitable police force was unwavering. He thought about his own journey, about growing up in a neighborhood where he had to constantly prove himself to be worthy of respect, about the friends and family members who had been victimized by an unjust system, about his father, who had taught him that real strength came from doing what was right, no matter how difficult the road. Marcus knew that the work wouldn't be done until the entire department had been restructured, until every officer had to face their biases and confront their own shortcomings. There was no shortcut to change. As he sat at his desk late one night, reviewing the progress of the department's internal review, he heard a knock on the door. "Come in," he called. Rachel stepped inside, her expression calm, but her eyes betraying a sense of urgency. She held a thick file in her hands, the kind of file that carried weight. "What's this?" Marcus asked, his curiosity piqued. "It's the report from the Independent Oversight Committee," Rachel said. "They've completed their initial investigation, and, well, it's worse than we thought." Marcus sat back, steeling himself for what was to come. Could it really get worse? Rachel placed the file on his desk, opening it to reveal a series of disturbing findings. More officers had been implicated, not just for their personal actions, but for a deeply entrenched network of corruption and misconduct that spanned years. Marcus flipped through the pages, his anger growing with each word. But at the same time, he felt something else, determination. "Now we've got the evidence," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady. "Now we make sure it counts." This was it. The truth had been laid bare. The road to redemption was long, but Marcus was ready to walk it. There would be more struggles, more battles ahead. But Marcus had learned one crucial thing over the past few weeks. Change was never easy, but it was always possible. And he wasn't going to stop until he had created a department that truly represented the community it served. The following months were nothing short of exhausting for Marcus. What had started as an isolated incident, a racial profiling case gone wrong, had evolved into a full-blown crisis for the police department and, by extension, the city. Public opinion was sharply divided. While many praised Marcus for his bravery in confronting the issues head-on, others viewed his actions as a betrayal of the very institution he had vowed to protect. He had spent countless hours in meetings with city officials, trying to keep the peace, to ensure that the reforms he promised wouldn't be buried under the weight of bureaucracy or resistance from within his own force. And still, there was the pressure from every side. From his officers, who were growing increasingly disillusioned by the changes, to the media, which had become less sympathetic as time wore on. In the quiet moments, Marcus would sit in his office, staring out the window, reflecting on how it had all come to this. He had been so idealistic when he first took the role of police chief. He thought he could change things from the inside, that his vision of justice and fairness could push the department in the right direction. But the realities of the institution, its deep-seated biases, its old-school mentality, had become painfully clear. It was during one of these reflective moments that Marcus received a call. "Chief, it's Rachel. We need to talk." The two of them met at a small cafe later that afternoon, away from the prying eyes of the department. Rachel was the only person who had stayed by his side through all of this. His team of supporters had been whittled down to a handful of officers who genuinely believed in his vision for reform, but even they were beginning to feel the strain of the situation. Morale was at an all-time low. Several veteran officers had resigned in protest, and the ones who remained were either too scared to speak up or too ingrained in the old system to change. "I've been thinking about everything we've been through," Rachel began, stirring her coffee slowly. "And I keep coming back to the same question. Is it worth it?" Marcus's heart sank. He had been expecting something like this. The cost of this battle had taken a toll on everyone involved. Rachel had been his partner, his ally from the beginning, but even she seemed to be questioning everything now. "I can't give up," Marcus replied quietly, his eyes fixed on the table. "I started this to make a real change. I can't just walk away." Rachel looked at him, her face a mix of concern and admiration. "I know you can't, but you've got to ask yourself, Marcus, what's the price of that change? Who's going to be left standing when all this is over?" The question lingered in the air. Marcus knew that Rachel wasn't just talking about him. She was talking about the department, the city, the community they had sworn to protect. The road ahead was uncertain, and the people who believed in reform were beginning to dwindle. "I don't know if I can answer that yet," Marcus said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I do know that I can't live with myself if I don't try." Rachel nodded, her expression softening. "I get it, I really do. But sometimes the cost of doing the right thing is higher than we realize, and not everyone's going to make it through." Marcus let out a long sigh, his shoulders heavy. He had been warned about this, the toll that fighting for change would take. The silence between them stretched, and for the first time in months Marcus allowed himself to consider the full weight of the situation. He had sacrificed a lot for this, his peace of mind, his relationships with colleagues, his reputation in the department, and yet the most painful realization of all was that not everyone in his department was going to come along for the ride. "I'm not going to stop, Rachel," Marcus said, his voice firm again. "But I need to face the fact that some of the people I'm trying to protect, they might not be able to see this through with me. They might never understand. And that's something I have to accept." Rachel smiled gently, her eyes filled with empathy. "You're stronger than you think, Marcus, and whether they see it or not, you're doing something that will make a difference, even if it takes time, even if it costs you more than you ever imagined." Weeks passed, and Marcus continued to push forward, despite the growing tensions within his department. His leadership was tested like never before. The division between officers who supported reform and those who resented it grew deeper. The rift was undeniable, but Marcus wasn't the kind of person who would back down, not now, not when so much was at stake. One day, after another round of heated discussions with his officers, Marcus received an unexpected visitor in his office. It was Officer Daniels, the same officer who had been involved in the initial traffic stop that sparked the entire chain of events. Marcus had expected Daniels to avoid him, to steer clear of the controversy he had ignited. But instead Daniels walked in, his face pale, his posture stiff. "Chief," Daniels said, his voice rough, "I need to apologize for everything, for the way I acted, for the things I said." Marcus looked up at him, surprised by the sudden shift in demeanor. He had never seen Daniels this way, genuinely remorseful not just for his actions but for the system he had been part of for so long. "Why now?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet but firm. Daniels swallowed hard before answering. "Because I can't live with myself anymore. What you said about changing the department, about doing what's right, it's starting to sink in. I don't want to be the person I was anymore. And I don't want to be part of a system that hurts people." For a moment, Marcus said nothing. He wasn't sure whether to believe Daniels. The officer had been part of the very system Marcus was trying to dismantle, but in that moment, he realized that change wasn't just about what he could do from the top down. It was about reaching the individuals who still had a chance to do the right thing. "Thank you," Marcus said finally, his voice soft. "But this isn't just about words. It's about actions. You have to prove you're ready to change. You have to make amends, not just for your own actions, but for the culture that's been allowed to fester here." Daniels nodded, his eyes full of remorse. "I'm ready. I know I've got a lot of work to do." As the weeks turned into months, Marcus began to see the fruits of his labor. Slowly, very slowly, the department started to change. The public's trust, once shattered, began to be rebuilt, piece by piece. The officers who had supported him from the start stood by him through the hardest of times. And slowly, more and more officers, like Daniels, began to see the value in reform. The road to redemption was long, but it was possible. Now, Marcus had a choice. He could continue to fight for change, knowing that it would cost him more than he could ever truly repay. Or he could walk away, let the department return to the status quo, and let the cycle of corruption continue. But there was only one thing Marcus knew for sure. He wasn't done. Not yet. What would you do if you were in Marcus's shoes? Would you fight for change even when the cost is high? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this story with others who believe in making a difference. The days after Marcus's encounter with Officer Daniels felt like a new beginning. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the department could truly change. Perhaps with the right people he could transform it from the inside out. But hope, as Marcus had learned all too well, didn't come without a price. The department's internal problems ran so deep, and the system was so ingrained in its ways, that every step forward felt like 10 steps backward. Even as his supporters continued to rally behind him, the pressure from the public and city officials mounted. They wanted results. Fast. The scandal had taken a toll on the city's trust in law enforcement, and the clock was ticking. In private meetings, Marcus was reminded time and time again that the people wanted change now. But change was never fast. It was gradual, slow, and full of setbacks. As much as he tried to focus on the reforms and the officers willing to change, Marcus couldn't ignore the persistent whispers in the background. Officers who had been loyal to the old guard, those who didn't want any part of the shift, were doing everything they could to sabotage his efforts. Rumors spread like wildfire. Marcus was out of his depth. He was too young to lead such a massive overhaul, and worse, some even questioned his integrity, calling him a pawn in a political game. The whispers were everywhere. Rachel had been his rock through it all, but even she was beginning to show signs of wear. Late nights, constant stress, and the constant balancing act of keeping the peace had started to take its toll on her. Marcus could see it in the way she held herself, the way her eyes grew tired in meetings, and the subtle cracks in her voice when they talked about the future. "You know, Marcus," she said one night, as they walked back to their cars after a particularly draining public forum, "we're pushing this reform harder than I ever imagined we would. But I'm beginning to wonder if we're asking too much from these officers. Not just them, but from ourselves." Marcus understood what she meant. They had been fighting for months, and while progress was happening, it was painfully slow. The department was like an old engine, so entrenched in its ways that every attempt to shift gears felt like it might break down. "But what's the alternative?" Marcus replied, his voice steady but full of frustration. "If we don't do this, if we don't push for real change, then we're just letting this cycle of corruption continue. And we're part of the problem." Rachel stopped walking, turning to face him. I'm not saying we shouldn't fight for change, Marcus, but I think we're ignoring the fact that it's not just the department we're fighting against. It's the whole system, the culture, the politics, the way things have always been done. We're not just changing a few policies, we're taking on an entire institution. Marcus exhaled sharply, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. I know exactly what we're up against, and I don't know if we can win. But I can't stand by and watch everything I've worked for crumble. I can't. Rachel looked at him, her gaze softening. I don't think you're going to win in the way you imagine. I don't think anyone does. But that doesn't mean you won't make a difference. The conversation lingered between them, neither of them knowing what the future held. A week later, the situation within the department took a sharp turn. A scandal broke, another one. But this time it wasn't about the officers involved in racist practices. It was about a high-ranking official who had been caught engaging in corrupt financial dealings. The media jumped on it, and once again, the department was thrust into the spotlight. The public's trust, already fragile, began to shatter once more. It wasn't long before Marcus found himself standing in front of a panel of city officials, his heart pounding as they grilled him about the new scandal. The pressure to fix everything, to clean up the department's image and regain public trust was suffocating. How can you stand here and tell us that the department is changing, Marcus? One of the city council members, a stern woman named Janet Collins, asked coldly, when this kind of behavior is still happening under your watch, how do you expect the public to believe that you're capable of handling this? How can you lead a department that has so many issues, so many failures? Marcus's jaw tightened. He had heard the same criticism over and over, and yet he didn't have a real answer for them. What could he say? That change takes time? That it's going to get worse before it gets better? He took a deep breath, steadying himself before responding. I won't sit here and deny that the department has problems, big problems, but the truth is, we've been sweeping things under the rug for far too long. What's happening now is exactly why we need to change. We need transparency, accountability, and leadership that isn't afraid to face the truth, no matter how painful it is. Councilwoman Collins crossed her arms. And how many more officers do you expect to resign or be fired in the process of this reform, Marcus? How many more public scandals do we need to endure before you admit that your approach isn't working? Her words hit like a slap to the face. Marcus fought to keep his composure. He understood her frustration. He felt it too. I'm not asking you to believe that everything is going to be perfect right away, he replied, his voice steady. But I am asking for time. Real, measurable change takes time. The people who are fighting for this, myself included, we know what we're up against, and we're ready to do the hard work. But I need your support. The room was silent. For a long moment, Marcus wasn't sure if he had made any headway at all. But eventually, Councilwoman Collins leaned forward. I'll give you time, Marcus, but don't waste it. The public is watching, and so am I. That night, Marcus sat alone in his office, staring at the files in front of him. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a message from Rachel. Marcus, I think we need to talk. It's important. His heart sank. What now? He quickly typed back, I'm free now. Meet me in 15. When Rachel arrived, she looked more exhausted than ever. Her eyes were shadowed with sleepless nights, but there was a sense of resolve in her demeanor. Marcus, she began, sitting down across from him, I think we're at a crossroads. Marcus's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Rachel took a deep breath. The changes are happening, slowly, but they're happening. But I think we need to brace ourselves for the fact that the hardest part is coming. The backlash won't stop. And we're going to have to make some tough decisions about who we trust, who we keep in this fight, and who we let go. I don't want to see you burn out. I don't want this to break you. Marcus stared at her, absorbing her words. The weight of everything, the department, the city, the community, felt heavier now than ever before. He was at a crossroads, just as Rachel had said. He couldn't continue this battle alone, but if he didn't keep fighting, everything he'd worked for would fall apart. I'm not sure I can do this without you, Rachel, he said quietly. I'm not sure I can do this at all. Rachel's voice softened. You're not alone. In this, Marcus, and you won't be. But you need to remember that change isn't just about the people who leave. It's about the ones who stay, the ones who believe in something better. The fight was far from over, but Marcus knew that, with the right people by his side, he could face whatever came next. What do you think, readers? Should Marcus keep pushing forward with these reforms even as the costs rise higher, or should he take a step back and reassess his path? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's continue the conversation. It had been months since Marcus had spoken to Rachel in that cafe, and the weight of their conversation had not been lost on him. The cost of this fight was mounting with every passing day. The department, once a place he had proudly dedicated his life to, now felt like a battleground, not just for justice, but for his very soul. Every time he thought he was gaining ground, something new happened to remind him that the forces working against him were just as determined, if not more so, to maintain the status quo. He hadn't expected things to be easy. Change, especially at this scale, never was. But even he hadn't anticipated the level of resistance from within the department. It seemed like every day brought another scandal involving corrupt officers or failed policies. His hands, though still tied by his position, were getting bloody from the effort it took just to keep his department afloat. One afternoon, Marcus found himself in an impromptu meeting with several senior officers from the department. Captain Richard O'Hara, a long-time veteran of the force and one of the most influential officers in the department, led the meeting. O'Hara was known for his traditional, no-nonsense approach, and Marcus had always respected him, until recently. The key moment Marcus entered the room, he could feel the tension thick in the air. O'Hara and the others were seated, arms crossed, not looking the least bit welcoming. As soon as Marcus sat down, O'Hara wasted no time. "We need to talk about the direction you're taking this department, Chief," O'Hara said, his tone blunt. "Things are getting out of hand." Marcus's stomach tightened. "What do you mean, Captain?" "This department's morale is in the gutter," O'Hara continued. "Officers are resigning, their loyalty is waning, and you're asking us to hold ourselves accountable for things we didn't do. You can't just change years of institutional culture overnight. You're putting us all in a position we don't deserve, Chief." Marcus felt his chest tighten. It wasn't the first time he had heard such criticisms, but hearing it from O'Hara, someone he had looked up to, stung more than he expected. "I'm not asking for everything to change overnight, but we can't ignore the rot any longer, O'Hara. We can't keep looking the other way when there's corruption in our ranks, when people are being hurt because we refuse to address the issues. You know as well as I do that we can't keep living like this." O'Hara leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "You want to fix a broken system, Marcus? You can't do it from the top down. You have to take care of your people first. If they don't trust you, if they don't follow you, nothing you do matters. Your reforms aren't going to fix the trust issues, the divisions. You're asking for too much too fast. And if you keep pushing the way you are, you'll have a department that's in shambles and no one will respect you anymore." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Had Marcus lost his credibility? He knew O'Hara was right about one thing. You couldn't lead a department if your own officers didn't follow. But he had no intention of turning back now. "We can't afford to go back to the way things were," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "This department's future depends on how much we're willing to change. I won't stop pushing for what's right." O'Hara studied him for a long moment, as though weighing his next words carefully. Finally he sighed, shaking his head. "Maybe you're right, Marcus. But you need to decide what kind of chief you want to be. The one that leads with force, or the one who leads with respect." Marcus knew this was a moment he could not ignore. It was a choice, a crossroads. As the meeting adjourned, Marcus left the room, his mind racing. It wasn't just the officers who had doubts anymore. It was the very foundation of the department that was cracking under the pressure of his reforms. But there was no turning back now. He had already crossed the line. The days that followed were marked by a series of difficult decisions. Officers who had been loyal to the old ways started to withdraw their support. And with every step forward, more colleagues were leaving the department, disillusioned by the changes Marcus was pushing. But through it all, Marcus still had his core team. He still had Rachel, and Rachel had an idea. One evening, as Marcus was working late in his office, Rachel walked in with a look of determination on her face. "Marcus," she said, "I think it's time we take our message directly to the people." He looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean we need to show them that change is happening, not just tell them. We need to take the stories of real officers, real people, who are standing with us. The public is losing faith in us because all they see is scandal after scandal. They don't see the officers who are on our side, the ones who want change." Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing her words. "A public campaign?" he asked slowly. Rachel nodded. "Exactly. Show the community the officers who are, fighting for the same thing we are. We need to tell the stories of those who are sticking their necks out for reform, and we need to show that we're not giving up." Marcus smiled, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. It was a risky move. If the public didn't respond, it could backfire. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the right move. The people needed to see the human side of this fight. Over the next few weeks, Marcus and Rachel worked tirelessly on the campaign. They interviewed officers, community leaders, and even victims of police misconduct, who had been directly impacted by the system Marcus was fighting to change. They told stories that were raw, that exposed the flaws in the system, but also highlighted the potential for redemption, for progress. The media campaign launched with mixed results, but something started to shift. Slowly, people began to see the complexity of the situation, the deep-rooted problems that Marcus was trying to address. They started to understand that this wasn't just about him, it was about the entire department and the city at large. One afternoon, as Marcus sat in his office, watching the results of their campaign unfold, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Daniels, the same officer who had once been part of the scandal that had sparked everything. Now, standing before Marcus, Daniels had a new expression on his face. A quiet one, but full of sincerity. "Chief," Daniels began, "I've been thinking about everything we've been through, and I realized something. The fight isn't just about what happens inside these walls. It's about what happens outside. You've been right all along. We can't just make change from the inside. We need to be transparent, and we need to be a part of the community. I want to be part of that change." Marcus looked at Daniels, surprised. The officer who had once been part of the old guard was now stepping up, offering his support for the reforms he had fought for all along. "I appreciate that, Daniels," Marcus said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Your support means more than you know." For the first time in months, Marcus began to feel like there was a real possibility for lasting change, but the battle was far from over. The reform efforts would continue to face resistance. The road ahead was long and difficult, yet Marcus was no longer walking it alone. Together with his team, with Rachel, with Daniels, and with the officers who stood beside him, he was ready to face whatever came next. The question was no longer whether or not they would change the department. The question was how far they were willing to go to make it happen. What do you think, readers? Can Marcus truly make a lasting change, or is the price too high? Will his campaign win the public's trust, or will the challenges become too overwhelming? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this journey together. The storm had passed, but the aftermath still loomed large. The department, the city, and Marcus himself were all standing at the precipice of something new, something uncertain. Yet, despite the heavy losses and the immense pressure, there was a palpable sense of possibility in the air. For the first time in what seemed like forever, Marcus could breathe. The public campaign had started to show real results. Support was growing. Officers who had previously been skeptical of the changes Marcus was pushing now began to come forward, quietly expressing their support. The media, too, had softened its tone. There were still skeptics and critics, but the conversations were shifting. People were beginning to see that Marcus wasn't just some young upstart, but a leader with a vision that wasn't about tearing the system down, but about rebuilding it from the ground up. But as with all things, the battle was far from over. One late afternoon, Marcus found himself sitting at his desk, staring at the reports that had been flooding in from every corner of the department. There had been improvements, clear, measurable progress, but there were still glaring issues that needed attention. The push for reform was far from complete. As Marcus reviewed the statistics, his mind wandered to the conversation he had had with Rachel just a few weeks ago. She had said it plainly. You have to decide what kind of chief you want to be. And Marcus knew, without a doubt, that he had made his choice. He would be the kind of chief who led with integrity, with a vision, and, most importantly, with empathy. But that didn't mean he had to do it alone. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and he looked up to see Captain O'Hara standing in the doorway. The usually stern, gruff officer had been a constant source of tension for Marcus, but now as he stood there was something different in his posture. O'Hara had always been the person to challenge Marcus at every turn, but now his shoulders were slightly slumped and there was a hesitation in his eyes. "Can I come in, Chief?" O'Hara asked, his voice quieter than usual. Marcus nodded, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Of course, Captain. What's on your mind?" O'Hara sat down slowly, looking uncertain for the first time Marcus could remember. He seemed to choose his words carefully before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said in that meeting a few months ago," O'Hara began. "About needing change, about the department needing change." Marcus didn't interrupt. He'd been through too many tough conversations with O'Hara to expect anything immediately. But he could see that something had shifted in the captain. "I was wrong," O'Hara finally admitted, his voice softer. "I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to believe it. But I've seen it now. I've seen it in the officers who have come to me. The ones who are standing with you, who believe in what you're trying to do. I've seen it in the community too. The public wants change. Hell, they need it. And I want to be part of that change. I want to help." Marcus leaned forward, surprised by O'Hara's words. He had never expected this. O'Hara had been the embodiment of the old guard, rigid, by the book, unbending. To hear him speak with this kind of humility was a stark contrast to the officer Marcus had known. "I appreciate that, Captain," Marcus said, his voice full of sincerity. "Your support means a lot, and I know this isn't easy for you. But change doesn't happen without everyone on board, and if we're going to make this work, we need all hands on deck." O'Hara nodded, still looking at the floor. "I don't expect you to forgive me for how I acted. I've made mistakes, but I'm here now. Let's fix this. Let's make this department something we can all be proud of again." In the weeks that followed, Marcus and O'Hara worked closely together. They began to address the lingering issues head-on, starting with the training programs for officers. They brought in external experts, former officers who had been through similar reforms in other cities, and began reshaping how the department would handle everything from community engagement to internal accountability. Slowly but surely, Marcus began to see the fruits of their labor. The atmosphere within the department started to shift. There was still resistance, of course. There were still officers who clung to the old ways, who didn't trust the new system. But as the reforms began to take root, as the culture within the department began to change, those officers started to look around and see that they were standing alone. They were being left behind. One morning, just before a major community outreach event, Marcus received a call from Rachel. She was in the middle of a meeting with some of the officers, trying to get a last-minute confirmation on logistics for the event, but there was something in her voice that immediately made Marcus sit up straighter. "Marcus, there's something you need to know," Rachel said urgently. "We've just gotten wind that there's a group of officers, veterans mostly, who are planning to protest at the event. They're not going to go quietly, Marcus." Marcus's pulse quickened. He had known that this kind of pushback was inevitable, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. "Are they going to cause trouble?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know yet," Rachel replied, "but I think we need to prepare for the worst. This isn't just about us. It's about the whole department. If they make a scene, it could set us back. Weeks, months even." Marcus's mind raced. This was a critical moment. If they could navigate this, it could be a turning point for the department. If they faltered, it could undo everything they had worked for. "I'm going to head over there," Marcus said after a long pause. "We'll handle this head on. I'm not backing down." As the event unfolded, Marcus stood at the front, facing an uneasy crowd. The tension in the air was palpable. He could see the officers who had gathered to protest, some with crossed arms, others whispering among themselves. But Marcus wasn't afraid. He had faced much worse than this. And this time he wasn't alone. The officers who stood with him, who believed in the changes he was making, began to step forward, joining him at the front. It was a silent act of solidarity, but it was powerful. The protesters might have been vocal, but they were outnumbered. And it didn't take long for their voices to be drowned out by the officers who stood with Marcus. When he finally stepped forward to address the crowd, the room fell into an expectant silence. "I know there's a lot of anger here today," Marcus began, his voice clear and steady, "and I understand why. Change isn't easy, it's uncomfortable, it's messy, but this is the path we have to walk together. We can't go back to the way things were, not when people's lives are on the line, not when this community deserves better. And we're going to get there together." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. The officers who had been hesitant to join him now stood proudly at his side. They didn't speak, but their presence was enough. The crowd began to disperse slowly. The protesters remained in the back, murmuring amongst themselves. But the momentum of the evening had shifted. Marcus could feel it. For the first time in a long time, he felt like they were truly on the path to something better. As the event wrapped up and the crowd left, Rachel found him in the parking lot, her face lit by the fading light of the evening. "You did it," she said, her voice full of pride. "You really did it." Marcus smiled, the weight of the moment settling over him. "We did it, all of us. The road ahead would still be difficult, but Marcus had learned something crucial. Change was possible, but it had to be earned, fought for, and sustained every single day. And with the right people by his side, Marcus knew they would get there, together. What do you think, readers? Do you think Marcus and his team will continue to succeed in transforming the department, or are the forces working against them too strong to overcome? Share your thoughts below and let's keep the conversation going.